In 2005, women continue to earn an average of 15% less than men across the EU economy, and as much as 40% less than men in Central Asia. What does this tell us? Does it mean that women are discriminated on the labor market? That the basic principle, equal pay for work of equal value, is not applied? Or is it due to the labor market structure, to the fact that women work less hours than men? Is it because men and women have different types and levels of qualifications? Or because women prefer jobs with fewer responsibilities? Is the gender pay gap caused by stereotypes influencing the way jobs are valued depending on whether they are dominated by women or men? In this presentation, we will try to answer these questions. We will see how the gender pay gap is calculated and what are the issues affecting its definition. We will see what the gender pay gap measures and what it does not measure, what are its possible causes, and how these may be investigated further. In general, the gender pay gap refers to the difference in earnings of men and women, what women on average take out of employment in monetary terms relative to men. It is calculated as the difference between average earnings of men and women as a percentage of average earnings of men. Being an average, the gender pay gap can only provide an overall picture of gender inequality in total pay for employment. It does not say if women and men with the same or similar jobs receive different compensations. It does not explain in itself why wage differences between men and women exist. To understand the gender pay gap and to better inform policymakers, it is necessary to disaggregate the gender pay gap according to various associated factors and possible causes, as we will see. The way the gender pay gap is defined and calculated is also important. There are different approaches in measuring the gender pay gap which affect the information that this indicator can provide. Estimates of the gender pay gap differ widely depending on the data source, the calculation method, as well as on the type of wages considered: hourly or monthly wages, net or gross wages, inclusion of additional benefits, and the categories of workers included in the calculation. For example, should we include only employees or self-employed as well? Different choices on these issues have an impact on actual figures and on the way data should be interpreted. In most cases, there is no right or wrong solution. It depends on what data are available at the national level and what aspects one would like to show. However, for the purpose of international comparisons, similar definitions and calculation methods should be used by countries. One of the factors affecting the gender pay gap is the time reference used to calculate wages. The gender pay gap based on monthly wages is generally larger than the one based on hourly wages, since women work as a general rule fewer hours than men and for this get lower salaries. Monthly or annual wages provide a better idea of the total overall difference and how much women take home compared to men in monetary terms. This approach, however, measures wage differences between women and men that are due not only to difference in payments, but also to difference in number of working hours. Using hourly wages, measured as the monthly or annual hours divided by the hours actually worked during that period, one can measure the difference in payment independently of the number of hours worked. This example illustrates the different gender pay gaps that can be constructed considering monthly, annual, and hourly wages. As can be noted, the pay gap based on annual wages is very similar to that based on monthly wages. On the other hand, in some countries such as the Netherlands, Israel, and Canada, the measure based on hourly wages is much lower, due mainly to the high percentage of women who work part-time. In fact, in the Netherlands, the percentage of women working part-time is much higher than in any other European country. It reaches 75% of all employed women, versus 19% for men. The indicators as calculated in this example measure two different aspects of gender inequality. The figures based on monthly or annual wages are overall indicators of different participation in the labor market, as well as of different payments that women have compared to men, while the figure based on hourly wages measures only the difference in payment for the work performed, independently of the number of hours worked. Type of employment. Another issue affecting the calculation of the gender pay gap is the type of employment that the wages refer to. Often only paid employment is included in the gender pay gap, that is, wages from paid employment of employees. This excludes income from self-employment, where remuneration is directly dependent on the profits derived from goods and services produced. While the gender pay gap for persons in paid employment has important policy applications, ideally the gender pay gap should be calculated also for the self-employed. However, most often reliable data on the income from self-employment is not available. As the example illustrates, in some countries there is not a large difference between the gender pay gap calculated on wages from paid employment and from all employment. However, in those countries where the proportion of self-employment is higher, these differences might be much greater, and excluding self-employment may underestimate the gender pay gap, as in Serbia. In fact, data on gender pay gap by status and employment category for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Ghana, and South Africa shows that the pay gap is particularly pronounced among own-account workers, both agricultural and non-agricultural, and is narrowest in public paid employment. The graph shows the gender pay gap in hourly wages for formal non-agricultural employment in Costa Rica and El Salvador, where it can be seen that for the two self-employment categories, employers and own-account workers, the gender pay gap is larger than for employees in public or private paid employment. In El Salvador, women in public paid employment have even higher wages on average than men. Concept of wages used. Another issue relates to the concept of income from employment used. So far, we have used the term wages and earnings interchangeably. However, in strict terms, the concept of wage refers to basic wages, which will not include additional payments for overtime, for example. Such additional payments are covered by the concept of earnings. However, the concept of earnings does not cover all amounts received by workers, such as irregular bonuses or Social Security benefits. Ideally, the gender pay gap should be based on as comprehensive as possible concepts, and all wage components should be included. But this may not be realistic, as not all countries are able to measure them effectively. For comparative purposes, therefore, it is important that the same concept is used. Eurostat, for example, uses the concept of earnings, where paid overtime is included while irregular bonuses are excluded. It is also important to consider if gross wages, that is, wages before any deductions for tax, pension, or Social Security contributions are made, or net wages are used. Main data sources on wages. It is also important to consider carefully the source of data to be used. There are three main data sources on wages: household-based surveys such as labor force surveys and household budget surveys. In the EU, another important source is the European Survey of Income and Living Conditions, EU-SILC. Enterprise-based surveys, such as the Structure of Earnings Survey conducted in EU countries once every 4 years. Administrative records, such as income tax or Social Security registers. There is no best source. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. Different sources measure different concepts of wages by including or excluding different components of wages and have different worker coverage. As we have seen, these differences affect the calculation and interpretation of the gender pay gap. In principle, the same type of source should be used for comparative purposes. For example, Eurostat has decided to use the Structure of Earnings Survey as a benchmark for all calculation of the gender. The example shows the gender pay gap calculated on the basis of different sources. In some countries, the differences are greater than in others. Enterprise-based surveys do not include self-employment, and sometimes do not include all sectors of economic activity or small enterprises. Administrative registers, such as those kept by the Social Security system in a country, do not include informal jobs and in general cannot provide data disaggregated by individual characteristics, such as education or age, or by job features, such as occupation level. Data on wages based on household surveys are the most complete regarding worker coverage and disaggregation by personal and job characteristics, but may have accuracy problems on measuring wages. Causes. The gender pay gap can be considered to be an overall measure of gender inequality in the labor market. It combines in one measurement two main factors leading women to have, on average, lower incomes compared to men: gender segregation and gender discrimination. The first component refers in general to the concentration of women and men in different industries, occupations, and grades that place women in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis men. Segregation across industries and occupations is commonly known as horizontal job segregation, while segregation across grades within occupations is often referred to as vertical job segregation. Both result in women having lower wages on average as compared to men. Horizontal and vertical job segregation are a consequence of existing gender roles in society, individual aspirations, education, and accumulated job experience, as well as personal choices and opportunities. The second component, discrimination, is a term with a precise legal definition in many countries. In general, it refers to the inferior treatment of members of one group compared with other groups. Sex-based discrimination in the labor market can lead to women being paid less as compared to men for work performed that is of a similar nature. It is also one of the factors leading to the glass ceiling effect, which prevents women from reaching the highest level jobs. In real life, it's often difficult to distinguish between these two factors. Still, to better understand the reasons leading to differences in women and men's earnings, it is important to disaggregate the pay gap according to various associated individual and job characteristics, as we will see. Differences in individual characteristics such as skills, educational level, age, and work experience may have an influence on the gender pay gap. For example, women are more likely to have a break in their career due to childbirth and childcare, which have an impact on their pay. Statistics show that the pay gap is in general higher for employees with children and married employees than it is for singles. This example shows the gender pay gap for the total of 27 EU countries based on hourly earnings. As can be seen, the gender pay gap steadily increases with increasing years of service. This means that on average, for men and women having worked the same number of years, the earnings of men have grown more than those of women. This graph shows the gender pay gap based on monthly earnings by level of educational attainment for selected countries. As can be noted, for all levels of educational attainment, there is a gap between average earnings of men and women. In most countries, the gap is highest among employees with tertiary level qualifications. This means that the gender pay gap remains high also among men and women having the same education level, and, interestingly, the gap is bigger among those with higher education. Conclusions. As we have seen, the gender pay gap is a complex and powerful measure, one of the most often used to measure overall gender inequality. There are many different ways to calculate the gender pay gap, each showing different aspects of inequality in pay. What is important is that countries analyze and make decisions on what aspects they intend to measure, and accordingly choose the most appropriate time reference, sources, worker, and income coverage. There is no perfect solution, but it all depends on what is needed. A small set of indicators on gender pay gap could be proposed to have a comprehensive picture of gender inequality in the labor market. What is important is to use the same method across countries for comparative purposes and in time for trends. An accurate measure of the gender pay gap may help monitor the situation of gender inequality.